Hi, I'm Louise Sunderland of the Regulatory Assistance Project, and I'm about to present some work that I've been doing with a colleague, Marion Santini, on building renovation and a new building renovation policy at EU level. But coincidentally, on the day I'm recording this presentation, I'm also having external wall insulation installed on my house. So whilst providing this introduction to the presentation, I thought I'd show you some real-life energy efficiency works and renovation works going on at home. The policy I'm going to present to you is minimum energy performance standards for existing buildings. And we need new buildings policies very clearly to achieve our Fit for 55 2030 climate goals, for which the building sector will need to go further and reduce, make emissions reductions of 60% by 2030. And you can see very clearly here, the graph on the left, that we are not on track to do that currently. To do that, we will need to massively increase the rate and the depth of renovation, moving, according to BPIE analysis, to deep renovations in 3% of the stock a year as quickly as possible this decade. So in response to this challenge, the Commission has introduced the Renovation Wave strategy at the end of last year, in which we saw this proposal for minimum energy performance standards that the Commission will propose as part of the revisions of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive later this year. And in this development, the Commission has proposed to look at the scope and timeline and the phasing of these standards. And most importantly, perhaps, it's recognised the importance of introducing MEPS, minimum energy performance standards, MEPS, alongside accompanying policies. And this really is just to illustrate the importance of those accompanying policies. MEPS do not stand alone. They are introduced with a framework of renovation enabling support. So that support comes in the form of information and practical support, and of course funding and finance, all packaged up through locally available one-stop shops. It also comes importantly with some social safeguards to ensure housing remains affordable and improve housing affordability if we can, and improve housing security so that renovations lead to reduced energy poverty, increased health and well-being, but don't lead to housing becoming more expensive. So what are minimum energy performance standards? Well, they are regulations that require buildings to meet a minimum performance standard at a point in time or a trigger point in their lifetime. Looking across all of the international examples, we see lots of different designs, but they all commonly follow this same structure of defining the target buildings, defining the standard to be met and the metric used to enunciate that. And defining a trigger point, a date or a trigger point in the building life cycle, for example, sale or rent of the building. And each of those three elements can be used to increase the ambition of the standard over time. And we're seeing MEPS being introduced increasingly in many areas across the world. And looking across all of those examples, we have defined 7 different types of models from all those examples. So I think the first thing to say here is that clearly MEPS is not just one policy, it's actually quite a flexible policy with lots of different options for design, which can be used to make the policies suitable for the relevant local context. I'm going to focus here on the top line, the 3 at the top. I think they are the ones most relevant for Europe. The single standard is the first, and this is the most common example we see in Europe at the moment. And the European examples use the Energy Performance Certificate, the EPC, as the metric to define the standard. And you can see here a number of examples. For example, in the Netherlands, offices must be EPC C by 2023, and in France, homes must be EPC E by 2028. The progressive standard builds on this single standard and aims to move properties up through the EPC brackets to improve their performance over time. So a simple example here is from Scotland, where privately rented homes must be EPC E from 2021, but at the outset, at the beginning of that regulation, it was made clear to building owners that they would also be required to bring those buildings up to EPC D from 2025. And the final example in this top line here is the deep renovation standard. And I should caveat that this hasn't been introduced in law anywhere as yet, But I think it's a very interesting model provided to us by the French Citizens Convention on Climate. And they've designed a standard which requires the worst performing buildings, so these are the F and Gs on the EPC, the French EPC scale of A to G, to meet the very high standard of EPC B in the first decade. And then beyond that decade, then the next worst performing, the Ds and Es, are also required to undergo deep renovations to meet those high standards. I'll brush over slightly more quickly the next standards. I think these two in particular have slightly less relevance for the scale in light of the scale of the challenge that we have in Europe. So the trigger point only standard is rarely used in isolation. It's more often used in advance of a firm compliance date. So we can start to create familiarity with the standard and move renovations forward by requiring the standard to be met at the sale of the building, for example, in advance of the firm compliance date. And the measures-based model requires simple insulation or heating measures to be installed in the building, more often used to define minimum decency standards for housing. I think therefore really isn't aligned with the ambition that we need in Europe at the moment. And finally, the perhaps what we might describe as fleet standards. These two standards really do require a strong stock manager to translate the standard into individual obligations for buildings within the stock. So, for example, in the United States, the city authorities place obligations on large buildings within the city. They use the data they have on those buildings to define the stock average and then require buildings below that average to make improvements. In Article 5 of the Energy Efficiency Directive, we have a renovation target model which equally relies on this strong stock manager, and this requires 3% of the floor area of central government owned and occupied buildings to be renovated each year. So just very briefly, we looked at these models and their suitability for achieving the objectives we have in Europe, and you can see the objectives on the left here are important urgent contributions to 2030 climate targets, alignment with 2050 full decarbonisation of the stock, very important contribution to Europe's social goals of alleviating energy poverty and delivering a fair and inclusive energy transition. And then importantly, enforceability of the standard and the signalling potential. I think you can clearly see here that the progressive standard and the deep renovation standard we felt in this analysis had the most potential to deliver on European goals. So just finally then looking at some more granularity on the design of minimum energy performance standards for Europe, looking at the target buildings, the standard and the metric, and the trigger points. It goes without saying when we think about the buildings that need to be targeted by MEPS, the European building stock is incredibly diverse. It is very difficult to make generalisations that apply fairly or equally to each country, which creates a challenge. It is very clear, though, that 75% of the floor area is homes. And so I think to achieve both the climate goals and, very importantly, these social goals, we do need to include homes in a MEPS framework as soon as possible. Many of the standards in Europe identify, for example, one tenure, privately owned homes or rented homes to come under standards. But I think when you look across the diversity of the European housing stocks, you can see that if we define that at European level, we would have incredibly different outcomes in different countries. So the left-hand chart here is showing tenure, where we can see that for example, in Romania, there are almost no rented homes, whereas in Germany, around 50% of the stock is rented. So we would have vastly different outcomes in different countries, and some countries would hugely miss out from the benefits of MEPS. And I think that goes as well the same really for if we were to define a standard that just addressed multifamily buildings or single family buildings. So for non-domestic buildings, similar story, very diverse stocks. Non-domestic buildings are the smaller part of the stock, but I think it is important to recognise that within that smaller part of the stock, there are some individual buildings that are very high energy users, large buildings with high energy use. So similar to the approach taken in the US, an ambitious standard that applies to these large high energy using buildings introduced early may well be very effective to move the renovation market and get some early quick wins on large emission savings. The metric we would select at European level, we have the energy performance certificate, and I think Europe is the envy of many other jurisdictions for that, and the European examples have relied on the energy performance certificate, so I think that becomes a clear first place to start. However, EPC frameworks are not harmonised across Europe. The EPC classes, for example, are usually A to G, but in some countries they might go from A plus to H. So there's a lack of harmonisation there. There's lack of harmonisation on the performance that each of those classes points to. As you can see on the left here, the worst performing buildings in Portugal, for example, are defined as those that have an energy performance of worse than or use more than 250 kilowatt hours per metre squared, whereas in Ireland that's 450. One further stage is that actually looking at the worst two EPC classes on whatever range that they use, the distribution of stock is very different in different countries. So looking at these worst two performance brackets, we see in some countries like Sweden and Germany upwards of 30% of the stock in just those worst two, all the way down to just 8% in Finland. So I think the lesson there is that trying to define an EPC class at European level as a minimum standard would be very, very tricky and really wouldn't be fairly applied across Europe. And looking finally at the dates and the timelines and the trigger points, very clearly in my mind we need firm dates for compliance rather than relying on trigger points. I think trigger points, as I've said, are very useful, and we see this from the international examples, useful to get activity going before the firm compliance dates, but we do need this progressive schedule of firm compliance dates to give us our roadmap for the relevant stocks. Trigger points really don't drive enough renovation, and they won't capture all buildings. So, for example, on average, European homes will only be sold once between now and 2050, which means at their next sale, every building would need to have a full decarbonisation renovation. And that average data really masks the fact that some buildings will be sold a number of times between now and 2050, and other buildings won't be sold at all. So we risk creating this underclass of buildings that aren't sold and therefore aren't renovated. Similarly, for rental cycles are slightly quicker, although huge variation in rental contract length in different countries. And I think an important point as well is for multifamily buildings, the use of trigger points only really misses the opportunity to align the interests of the diverse stakeholders there. MEPS really have been identified as a key tool to ensure that all owners of units and occupiers of units are headed in the same direction with their renovation in a multifamily building. If different units are required to be updated at different times when they're sold or when they're rented, we really miss out on that opportunity. So drawing all of that together, we come to some recommendations that we hope will help the Commission to define a workable framework of MEPS at European level. First of all, we need MEPS to align with the 2030 and 2050 climate goals. The Commission should not shy away from ambition. This is a huge opportunity to introduce quite a revolutionary policy. And this should be backed up with firm dates for compliance, as I've just explained. We should also design MEPS hand in hand with the climate goals, with mindful of the social benefits that MEP can produce. And this is both in the design of the MEPS, which buildings, which standards, but also very importantly with the framework of enabling that goes around them. MEPS should cover all buildings, and standards should be introduced at the very earliest opportunity. And we think that is towards the end of this decade, before 2030. The MEPS framework should be designed to drive deep renovations. So that's both, once again, through the design of the standard, but also through the enabling framework. So, for example, support and incentives that are more generous for deeper renovations can encourage building owners to go further than the minimum standard. In order to make use of the energy performance certificates, as we see they are very useful, we need to expand the coverage very quickly before 2030 of energy performance certificates. So look for new opportunities to deliver performance certificates to buildings. We need to create some level of comparability of those certificates across Europe. So as we found, defining an EPC band common to all member states would create hugely different results, but perhaps defining an objective, for example, increasing stock performance by a certain percent, identifying the certain percent worst performing buildings to bring under standards first, those kinds of objectives may be more appropriate at European level. And it goes without saying, we need to massively scale up renovation support, one-stop shops and comprehensive funding and finance in advance of any compliance date. We need to increase EU funding, and I think particularly targeted on low-income and energy-poor households. And we need to introduce strengthened social safeguards for housing affordability and housing security. And this is just an illustration of how we do that, the priorities between now and 2030. We need to scale up the renovation framework starting now. Thank you very much for listening.